I think we're in pretty good order, and I'm about ready to go. I would remind you that our host is Karen Needles. You see, she is the director and the creator of the Lincoln Archives Digital Project. If you have not ever been to that site, you should do so. It's lincolnarchives.org, I believe it is. And it's got a ton of really good material on there. Karen has been working on this religiously for more than 20 years. It's where I met her. She was started on this. And there's just some neat things on there. So you should go visit. And more than that, I will say this. She can stand donations. They're not tax deductible, but what she does, she maintains all of this at her own expense and stuff. And it's a tough road to hoe. So if you have some shekels that you're willing to share and so forth, I believe there's a donate button in there, and by all means, go ahead and do that. In the meantime, enjoy what she has to do because it's really great. Okay, I got 8 o'clock. I'm ready to start. Brian, are you good? You on?
I'm on.
Okay, guys, let's get a start. Our guest tonight's Brian Steele Wills. He is fresh from a gig playing Santa Claus in the Macy's Day Parade on the third remake of Miracle on 34th Street. You may not recognize him. He was the drunkard that was down drinking that the new Santa Claus came in and had to replace him. And then he was drunk and they were moving him off the thing. He said, a man's got to do what a man's got to do. But his beard is real, and he says it's going to disappear. Yeah, I guess you fulfilled half the requirement. When's the beard go, Brian?
Well, I had said that I was going to keep it until Georgia won a national championship and Green Bay won the Super Bowl. So I've done half of that.
Well, Brett Favre put the words on Aaron Rodgers and told him that he didn't mind him breaking his record, but he was now going to have to win a Super Bowl to cap it off and make it worthwhile. So you've got something to look forward to. It'll certainly be an interesting month coming up, hopefully.
I'll keep it until middle of February, I guess.
Yeah. Brian, the thing I've been fascinated with, of course, when we met, you were way out Western Virginia at the University of Virginia College. It was, and it took 2 airplanes, a helidrop, and delivery from the Green Beret to reach where you were stationed at. You were the Cumberland Gap. I don't know whether it was before you, behind you, above you, or below you, but you were out in the sticks. And then you got religion and you got moved to north of Atlanta, and you're at Kennesaw at the great Kennesaw Mountain area and then the battlefield there and stuff. Tell us a little something about your work at the Kennesaw Center.
Well, one of the things, Lynn, was I realized when I was in the mountains of Southwest Virginia, and of course I love there, the farm is there that I'll retire to eventually, and Virginia is always home. I was born and raised in Virginia, went to school in Virginia till I got 2 degrees at Georgia, which is part of the reason that I support the Bulldogs, and then taught for a couple of years at Georgia Southern, and then taught at what was then Clinch Valley College of the University of Virginia, then became University of Virginia's College at Wise, up until 2010. So I taught for a good long while there, 17 years, and then came to Kennesaw. And while the mountains of Southwest Virginia were bushwhackers' paradise, there just wasn't a whole lot of large scale activity in that region.
Yeah.
And you're closer to 6 other state capitals than your own. So you're a long way from a lot of things. Well, in Kennesaw, it's the Kennesaw State University. I'm, 20 minutes given traffic, whatever that might be, from the mountain, from the battlefield park there. I'm 2 hours end to end, basically, of the Atlanta campaign from Chickamauga all the way into Atlanta. And while Atlanta has its own special joys, and we can talk about that at another day, it's Kennesaw is getting closer and closer, whether we like it or not. And Atlanta moves out further. The Braves have come out to Cobb County, and Cobb County is the fastest growing county in Georgia. And so Kennesaw has benefited as well from really going from basically a junior college when it was first formed to the now second, as the last statistics we've got, second largest school in Georgia, behind Georgia State. So it's changed enormously. Still, in some ways, kind of has a small college mentality, and yet, a major research institution, and has continued to grow. The center was formed by my predecessor, John D. Fowler, and he taught Civil War and Reconstruction, among many other things, and formed this. And it was really more of a program-oriented center, and it has been and continues to be that. We have, I call them our big three. We have our annual symposium is in March usually, although during the sesquicentennial, we actually had two, had one in March and one in October. But we've now got it in March 19th, and we'll have Jack Davis and Bobby Horton come down. So we hope people will come down to listen to them, if nobody else. And I'll throw in a few words. And we're going to do history and memory in a sense, because we're going to do sort of a tribute to two of our honorary advisory board members who passed away in recent years, Bud Robertson, James I. Bud Robertson, and Wiley Sword. Two great figures, and we're going to do that in March. Then in June, we do our Vince Dooley, and yes, it's that Vince Dooley. He loves history, loves gardening too, by the way, but loves history. And he is gracious enough to come as much as he's able, and he's been able so far every time. Saw him on TV; he looked great during the national championship. So that's in June, and then in August we have a collector's showcase, and we're really excited about that. That's very much an educational event, and two of those three are also sponsored in part by the Georgia Civil War Commission, which I'm a member of.
Well, send us the information on it. If you put us on your mailing list, we'll circulate it to. We got about 7,000 people we send stuff out to, so we'd be happy to put it out.
That'd be wonderful, and we'd love to have as many people show up as possible. And of course, when you talked about shekels, we could use shekels too. So.
I understand that. Well, I'm hoarding mine jealously as I have opportunities, but. Something else that's fascinated me, and we're going to get to Thomas here in just a moment, and this actually is going to segue into it, but I do have some curiosity, because I've enjoyed and read all of the books that you've written. Starting, of course, with Battle from the Start, Nathan Bedford Forrest, right, which really sprung out. It came out at a really good time, I think, and really just excited people. And your writing style was so solid with that it quickly became the standard against which all forest studies would be placed against. And of course, with the good came the bad. And maybe another time this year we'll get together and we'll talk a little bit back about forest again, because it's not really necessary at this point. But then you did the book on your home area down around Suffolk and so forth, and you also did a book that I think was I remember a guy named Tulip or whoever did a book on the Civil War on film, and you wrote something. You did an essay or a book talking about how
Civil War in cinema,
Civil War in cinema, which I thought was very, very well done. It was a good juxtaposition with what was it? What was his name? Tonop? Brett?
No, there's been several, but what I was trying to do, of course, was do something that was, would cover the major topics and show how history and Hollywood did not always mesh particularly well, and yet get some sense that if somebody wanted to learn a little bit more about it, they could. whether it was Civil War in the West or the divided families, and then I did specific movies. I did Gettysburg. I did specific movies, Alvarez, Kelly, and the Beefsteak Raid. There were some
Yeah.
fun movies.
Oh, sure. And then I think you came out with a smaller book on Fort Pillow, or you addressed Fort Pillow, if I recollect.
Yeah, I did really kind of wanted to talk about excess in warfare because I felt like one of the things we didn't need was another minute rehash of Fort Pillow. I thought what we needed is to understand that war is a pretty horrible event regardless, and that we've had excess before the Civil War, more excess than just Fort Pillow during the Civil War and excess after the Civil War. So I would talk about things that included some of the events that occurred in the American Revolution all the way up to the Philippine insurrection, World War II
Sure.
in the Pacific, and of course, Vietnam.
I think anybody who has served in the military appreciates that somebody in the civilian world recognizes the chaos which is combat and war, and how quickly things escalate and get out of hand.
And I still think, and I said this in the original Forrest book that you've already referenced, and I also said it in Fort Pillow, that I think what Forrest really did was to lose control of the battle himself. I don't think that he was trying to perpetuate a massacre, and I've got all of my arguments about that, but that he really just lost control, and for any number of reasons that I tried to cover. But again, that war just has on the battlefield, you have a momentum of its own, each battle, and some of them do get out of control.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, San Jacinto, think about running defeated individuals into the swamp at San Jacinto, and yet we don't.
Yeah, 15-minute fight,
think,
it's over.
Yeah, but we don't think of Sam Houston as being an evil person. So
no, but they flat out did, and to have walked that field is to not know exactly what you're talking about, and it's something that you really had to deal with.
that's right.
Let's go ahead and get into Thomas, because that's what the people came to hear tonight. I know why you did George Thomas. He's from your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
And he's fascinating. I mean, here, for all the people talking about they had to stay with Virginia, and you had all this strong sentimentality. I can't lift a sword against my own family, and yet you have these anomalies like here suddenly is John Pemberton ends up going south because he's married to a Norfolk girl and has to go south. But then you got George Thomas, military veteran, West Point graduate, and he says who wanted to go to VMI, wanted to be the professor that Stonewall Jackson became, and didn't get that job, and yet when the war comes, he stays with the North. Why do you think George Thomas didn't go south?
There's every number of arguments about that. And by the way, I should say before I get along that I love biography. And that's another reason that I wrote about Thomas. Yes, he's from Southampton, which is neighboring to my native county at the time of Nansemond County. It's now all Suffolk, but it used to be Nansemond County, and Southampton's next door. And so it is because of that. It's because of a book that you referenced, that I did Suffolk in the southeastern part of Virginia, and barely touched on Thomas in that, but at least again was right on the cusp of getting into Thomas territory. But the answer to your question is as complex as Thomas, because of course Thomas had a long-standing career in the old army. So did others who made other choices. But he had really left his home for quite a while, established himself in a field that I think, again, he felt like he had an obligation to appreciate the education that he got, the service that he had performed in many arenas, including Mexico and Seminole Wars in Florida, out west, and a variety of settings. So he'd had a long career. He married a woman from Troy, New York, and there are a lot of people who felt like that might have influenced him. He would say she was 31 when they got married, and he was a little older. So they were older together before they got married. And then, so she would say that the general always knew what he should do. Now, I'm not going to suggest that anyone listening to this would understand what that actually means. But if a wife says that her husband will understand what he should do, there's bound to be some understanding of what that will be.
What the hell does he really mean?
I don't think
John Pemberton didn't know.
well,
He didn't have a clue.
And she'll say that we never talked about it. But you also know there are a lot of ways of communicating, whether you have an overt conversation or not. But he would always say that he believed that he had an obligation to the Constitution. I mean, he really felt like it was more than just the influence of his wife. I mean, that he did not feel like that was something that was the major force that drove him to make the choice that he made.
Yeah, it's interesting too, and I remember whereas Thomas, the complexities surrounding him were such that he paid a huge familial penalty for this. I mean, his family just his sisters, so they just wouldn't have anything to do with him any longer. He turned his portrait to the wall and stuff, and it strikes me that when you look at that and you look at losing hearth and home and family, that there's something really substantive down low there. And I would share with you one quick story that you'll appreciate on John Pemberton. When I was doing my master's work at William and Mary, I was in Schwemm Library in their archives, and I got Benjamin Stoddard Ewell's papers. He had been the president of the college. He was Richard Stoddard's brother. And I got into his papers. He had done a reminiscent of the war and his time as commander of the 32nd Virginia. And 2 pages in there describe him working for Magruder and Pemberton showing up in Williamsburg. His wife had sent him over to figure out what the hell was going on. And Pemberton was just all a bubble and blathery and stuff. And he said, "John, I just don't know what to do." And he said, Ewell says Magruder poured Pemberton a tall, stiff drink, and he handed it to him and put his arm around his shoulder. And he says, "John, we're just slaves to these women. You know what you'll do, and you'll do it soon." And but what was really neat was that, Pemberton was always treated as a trophy by the South. And yet George Thomas never is respected in the North. Doesn't appear he's ever respected in the North. Everybody is suspicious of this man who didn't go with his native state. Could you comment on Thomas's relations with his fellow officers and with Northern politicians once the war started?
Well, let me do the family first, because you've already made a comment in reference to that. He apparently had a brother who lived in Vicksburg who said that he did not think that George would be able to make any choice other than the one he made. So not everyone in the family seems to have looked at him as a pariah. There is a question about whether there's a portrait to be turned to the wall. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. They certainly didn't want to talk to him or about him or anything else. They were upset about the decision he'd made. And later on in the years, when there's an attempt to try to get to know the early Thomas, to sort of see those early years and the influences, they're very sort of closed-mouthed about what they say. It's very basic, he was raised well and that sort of thing, and not much more than that. So they certainly they didn't embrace him, the sisters. And so you're right about that. In the North, I don't know that there was this general feeling about Thomas one way or the other. To be blunt, he will build himself up into a figure that people will know more about as the war goes on. And as the war goes on, he will allay those concerns, so that by the time he becomes sort of a household name, he has established himself in a way that I don't think as many people would look at him askance. That doesn't mean that there weren't people in powerful places that didn't have questions about him. The famous line is, "Let the Virginian wait," at one point by President Lincoln. And then, as I would like to say, in the aftermath of Chickamauga, the president is no longer waiting.
Yeah.
He says that no one can perform better than Thomas did on that occasion. And so by then he's really, convinced that Thomas has done yeoman service, and no one can question that. And anybody who does is mistaken. And even the president is making that point. So there were a lot of concerns. Supposedly Sherman famously is going to see Thomas at the very beginning of the war. Remember, Thomas is mostly in the Western Theater, almost exclusively, but he's not entirely. At the very beginning, he's actually in the Eastern Theater. He will take on a Thomas Jonathan Jackson before he's a Stonewall, and will help to defeat him at Falling Waters. And so there was a period right around that time that Sherman and Thomas supposedly talked. Well, they had been, of course, classmates at West Point, even a roommate at one brief time. But the point is that Sherman will ask Thomas, what's his plan? What's he going to do? And
Right.
supposedly Thomas says, I'm going south, Comp. And Sherman gets almost apoplectic. You're going south. I have spoken for you. I've stood by you. You can't go south. Think about what you'll do to me and to what I've said. He said, no, I'm going south at the head of my troops. So, don't worry about it. Everything will be fine. And of course, the hero of Fort Sumter from the Union side vouches for a lot of these folks, including Thomas, early on when Anderson speaks on behalf of Comp, Sherman, and on behalf of Thomas and others. That's sort of the early sort of stamp of approval that helps them, both of them. Because remember, Sherman weathers a difficult time early in the war. And
That's right.
Thomas, the doubting of Thomas.
Well, I find that when you look at the people trying to get aligned on the sides as they try to do what they believe they were meant to do, more recently people have really been all over Robert E. Lee and his intentions and stuff. But I remember having a long conversation with Alan Nolan right after he had come out with his controversial book Lee Considered, which was kind of a pile on after Tom Conley had done A Marble Man a generation before, and then Elizabeth Pryor comes along and writes Reading the Man, and in each instance, I think progressively they got more into Lee's personality and intent in each sequential analysis of him. I know even your mentor Emory Thomas did an analysis of Lee in his biography on Lee. When you were doing your work on Thomas, what were the things that were the aha moments for you? Did you I think didn't he had a kind of a choppy set of archives, didn't he? That he just, were his archives good to work with, or did you have a lot of gaps in there?
Well, you had a lot of gaps because his wife ends up getting rid of most of their personal papers later after his death. So there's not this trove of personal papers that you can tap into. Thomas was a very private individual in public. In other words, he held a lot of his opinions to himself in public settings. Now, he spoke in his letters. There's a set of letters from some of his staffers, and there's more correspondence from that angle than other sources. And he's more open in those private writings. And I got a feeling that he probably said a lot of things that we would like to have known what he said and thought. And I'm guessing, and of course that's all it is, a supposition, that he probably said a lot of things about a lot of people, including maybe Grant and Sherman and who knows who else, Schofield and others. But we'll never know in that sense because those letters didn't survive. So it's very problematic. When I said I mentioned about biography and liking biography, I'm very proud of my William Dorsey Pender biography. Well, Pender wrote a lot and those letters survived. Forrest had 6 months of formal education, and there's not much there in the written record. So I've kind of gone from one end to the other of not having much to work with and then having a lot to work with, and
Sure.
then back with Thomas not having as much, only because of personal papers, only because they didn't survive. But he, whenever he spoke, he was just very reluctant. He says at Kentucky, he will say, "What does a man give a damn speech for?" He doesn't usually say bad words, but once in a while one will slip through on him when he's very emotional. They said when he get really worked up, he would work his beard up, and when he was calm, he would smooth his beard down. And so there was tells. There were some tells when you ask about those eureka moments, because you want to look for the things that make those people human, that make
Yeah.
it interesting. Why does this guy, how does he tick, and why does he think the way he does? And I thought there were a lot of great moments. I found one reference where he talks about later after the war when he goes to the Pacific and then goes on a massive inspection tour of Alaska, which has only recently been purchased. And he makes a comment again, supposedly one of the knocks on him is that he's slow. And he says, I did a lot of traveling, pretty fast traveling for a slow man. So he was very sensitive to it, and yet he didn't
Yeah.
make it clear that he was sensitive out in the open. He sort of made that as an aside, and you would have to know that and read into it to understand. After, when he's making comments about being at Buena Vista, he says, I did some pretty good, he said, that people always think of me as again, being too meticulous, whatever. He said, but I stayed in place, and held my position for Bragg's artillery. And so his comments were usually kind of a little bit, I was slow to retreat, in other words. And so the point is that I think a lot of times he kind of threw in those asides, and you'd have to know the personality to really see that. But they said that when he gave, even at West Point as a student, then later in front of Congress, that he was very nervous when he would be in public speaking. And it was, one comment was that his hand was shaking like an aspen leaf. And so it's just hard to imagine this very confident figure, you would think, being again in those moments where he's almost mortified and terrified, and yet of course proceeds because that's what he has to do.
Do you ever think that, at Nashville, obviously Lincoln and Grant, Halleck all want him to move to finish off Hood. They believe, they can't understand why he hasn't already done so after Franklin and so forth. And of course, we have the advantage of 30,000 feet of observation to take a look at what, first, Hood wasn't going anywhere. He was there to be polished off. He wasn't going to get any stronger. There was no sense, and you didn't have to do anything till you were ready. But the reason I've opened that particular question is people are so impatient with him that there's an order that he can and should be relieved for not moving as rapidly as the government wants him to move. Was this a unique circumstance with him, or was there a group, Grant, Halleck, perhaps Stanton? Were there a group of people in the hierarchy who really were still even suspicious of Thomas's motives, even this late in the war?
Well, the quick answer to that question is no, they weren't suspicious of his motives. Grant, Sherman, and all the others really did respect him, even with their doubts early. Those doubts, as they became increasingly less, when they became allayed, as I put it, by what Thomas did, that was even less a concern late in the war. I always say, and there's this question about whether there's an antagonism between Grant and Thomas. And I always say that I don't think there was an antagonism. I think the biggest problem with Thomas from the Grant and Sherman perspective was that they waged war very differently than he did. And he believed in being, prepared meticulously, and then you do what you need to do, because the more you prepare before you go into the contest, the more likely it is to end the way you want it. Whereas Sherman and Grant and others kind of, let's roll the dice and we'll figure it out. If it doesn't work on day one, maybe it'll work on day two. And when you think about it, you've got a Shiloh and you've got other battles where that had happened with Grant. So he has a reason to believe, well, he had Fort Donelson. He's got a lot of reasons to think a setback at the beginning does not necessarily have to end in setback, because it didn't. He typically turned things around. Thomas would prefer not to face the chance of setback. He would prefer to try to strike from the most advantageous position possible. And so at that point in the war, Grant had gave a leniency to Sherman and to Sheridan and to others that he did not give to Thomas. But again, I don't think it was because he had an antagonism toward Thomas. I just think he had a trust in Sherman, trust in Sheridan and others that he didn't in Thomas. And basically, one of the comments that I've found and then put in the book toward the end of the war, even as after Nashville, he says, if he doesn't use his army, I'm going to deplete it. I'm going to take it from him because I'll use it. If he doesn't use it, I'll use it. Well, Thomas's feeling is you launch a campaign, you finish your campaign, and then you take time to get set for the next one. What Grant wanted to do was keep rolling and keep going. And so they just didn't wage war the same way. And I don't think it's from Shiloh antagonisms. Some people say Halleck and his actions after Shiloh towards Grant and favoring Thomas in some ways, that was held against him. I don't think that's it. I really do think they just didn't mesh in that way. And Chattanooga may be one of the best early illustrations of that, where comes in and wants to strike immediately. And Thomas says, we're not in any condition to attack. And we can attack. And if we attack now, it will be foolish. And we can't do that. And Grant gets second opinions, finds out that Thomas really isn't as crazy as it sounds. And so he waits. But what does he do? He sends for Sherman to come from Meridian, Mississippi. And it's going to depend on him. And the great irony is that at Chattanooga, it isn't Sherman who turns that flank and destroys Pat Claiborne and takes the Confederates off their position. It's Thomas's troops.
It's Thomas right up the gut.
Right, up Missionary Ridge, right.
Yeah. One of the books that I found that it was really thought-provoking was Tom Buell wrote a book called Warrior Generals.
Yes.
And as he did, and I've seen several of these, and you have too, you get Tom Chapin wrote a book of, the partnership that won the war, Sherman, Grant, things like that. So we see these coming up all the time. But Buell made a really interesting observation and a proposal, and he defended it, I think, reasonably well. But it always left me with some questions. And his proposal, as you know, was that of all the Union generals, of all the warrior generals, that Thomas was the greatest of them all, that he logically, had he ascended to the lead of the Union armies, similar to what had been offered to Lee, that Thomas, in fact, would have been the great hero of the war because he would have accepted it and he would have done extremely well. That created a lot of controversy with the Grant Sherman cabal that has pretty much predominated for 130 years or so when Tom came out with it. But how are you with that thesis? Who was the greatest Union general, and who was the person? We know who won the war, but if you were Abraham Lincoln and you were facing what you're facing in 61, where would Thomas have fit in this, and what would you have done with him if you had a chance to use him?
Well, we're back to that argument about whether you have any suspicions about Thomas. And by the way, suspicions don't have to be about whether you think he'll be loyal. I don't honestly think that even his biggest detractors would have ever questioned loyalty. It's enthusiasm. It's degree of how much he would commit to fighting a war against his fellow Southerners that I think was, let's wait and see how that plays out. So because of that, I don't think Lincoln could have turned to Thomas under any circumstance at the beginning of the war. It just wasn't going to be, he wasn't the figure that would have risen to the level of such certainty about whether he was capable and enthusiastic, not to mention loyal, because again, I don't think anybody questioned his loyalty. It's funny when when I've spoken about Thomas in Southampton County, someone would come up to me and say, "Well, why do you want to talk about that traitor?"
Yeah.
Of course, he went a way other than they might have wanted or than they did want. And so it's all perspective, which is why I don't like the T word. I don't like the word traitor for Thomas. I don't like it for Lee. I don't like it for any of them because they're making the choices given the circumstances they're in to the best of their abilities at the time. And it tends to be traitor gets to be too judgmental and too easy a term to throw out there regardless. And this whole current bashing of Lee and so forth is just, it makes us feel better. It certainly doesn't advance history. It doesn't advance knowledge.
That's right.
It doesn't do anything to help us. And that's unfortunate because, again, to dismiss Thomas because you don't like the choice he made or to dismiss Lee because you don't like the choice is equally, I think, a loss for us, not a loss for them. They made the choice they felt that they had to make.
Yeah, all the controversy over the removal of the statues and so forth at VMI, I've been particularly involved with it because of the Jackson statue and in a chat room the other day talking with other alumni, we were talking about it because Jackson has apparently been moved to Newmarket, and that's where he's going to be re-erected. So he will get public display again. But my comment to him was that Jackson and Lee were both greater men than to have ever tolerated somebody ever erecting a statue to him. So I think they all would have been very remarkably, and I'm going to tie this to Thomas in a second. I think they would have been remarkably embarrassed to have seen a monument erected to them when they all believed that all glory belonged to God and that they were just God's instrument in doing what they believed they had to do. Your point on enthusiasm with somebody who's going to stay with the cause, I think is really a brilliant one. I think you've really hit the nail squarely on the head with that, because it isn't so much a matter of a person's responsibility as it is the person's what's deep down inside of them that animates them to make the decisions they make. And you can't read a man's soul, you can't read his heart, you can't read his mind. You can only judge him by the actions that he takes. And when you've got a guy like a Thomas, or who is fundamentally a private individual, or Jackson, you only get flashes of their brilliance only occasionally, and that's because they are compelled to display it by the circumstances. And otherwise, they would just walk down the street and you would think they'd be very boring people because you wouldn't know much about them because they were so private and so reserved. I get that sense of Thomas. So where I want to take this for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, is you and I have talked for a while. We had missed each other for a number of years. We were just in opposite directions for a while, and I was so delighted that we found each other again and got to talk it again and stuff. And we talked about other things that you want to do, because we didn't want to just make you a forest guy forever and ever and ever. We want to see what else was of interest to you. And you proposed this Thomas program to me probably about 3 years or so ago. And you said it was something that you'd be interested in doing. And I asked you to sketch it out. And we kind of went back and forth a couple of times. And finally I said, yeah, let's go ahead and let's make this happen. So how about talking to us about why you want to do this program and what you're going to do to help people understand why a program on Thomas is worth going to.
Well, there's no question that when you read a book, you can learn in depth about any aspect of an individual or about a battle or a campaign. But there's no substitute for going to the ground, to going to the land, see the sites themselves. You come away with a greater appreciation for what you can read in depth at some other point, whether that's as preparation for going or as something that you do after you've been intrigued and you go home and you want to read more about it. So you start thinking about Thomas. Here's a man who, of course, is supposed to be excellent at defense, and he was. And there are signs and places where defense is critical, and he is the critical figure in doing that kind of conduct on a battlefield. And Stones River is an example of that, and certainly Chickamauga, where he's the Rock of Chickamauga. But he was also offensive minded and could be very effective in the offense when he pushed himself and when he pushed his men. And by the way, I will say that Thomas would have always said, you don't need a statue to me in the sense that my men made me and my men made me the commander that I am. So give a statue to the men. The men were the ones that should be remembered. And that was always his main push, was not so much for himself. By the way, because he's a Virginian, he doesn't also have a big spokesperson in Congress to help push him along, because he's not married to the right family in the right place.
Right.
With the right kind of political connections. He doesn't have that. He always thought that history will do me justice, and he always thought that my actions will speak for myself. But as he'll say later, when he finally gets promoted at the end of the war, he says, I earned this a year ago, basically. I earned this at Chickamauga, and it comes after Nashville. So he was convinced that somehow all of this would speak for itself. And I think the one lesson we can learn from Thomas is that, don't hope that everything will speak for itself. You really do have to sometimes speak yourself or have someone speak on your behalf. You have to have something. And I don't think Thomas maybe fully appreciated that. His wife, by the way, is one of his great spokespeople, but they are more after the war and after he's dead than before. But getting back to the point, when we go to sites, you have to kind of decide. You only have so many days. Where can you go? Where do you see Thomas as he develops, as he grows, as he begins to really illustrate his capabilities on the battlefield? And Mill Springs is one of the obvious early examples of that. And what a great site! And yet you see again his character and personality, as well as his military capabilities, a small engagement and yet a significant one. You can argue that there are no decisive battles in the war because, while you wanted a battle of annihilation, it's very hard to annihilate an enemy army. But he comes about as close as you can, and Mill Springs is an example of that, where basically the opposing force just dissolves. And then at Nashville, the opposing force will reconstitute, but it's going to also diminish considerably more than most armies do after a single battle. So battles like that can really get you some insight. Again, that defensive capability, and yet being capable of carrying out an offensive action when it's necessary. The Atlanta campaign is an important campaign with Thomas really as the central army, the largest army of a three-army juggernaut that's closing in on Atlanta under William T. Sherman. And it's basically sort of the bedrock around which Sherman moves, and he uses his smaller armies to do a lot of the maneuvering and do a little bit more of what he sees the Army of the Cumberland as being, frankly, a little too ponderous. That's one of the things about Sherman, by the way. He can say some very nice things about Thomas and in the same breath say something negative. So my book actually is called As True as Steel, which is part of a Sherman quote, but it starts, he may be slow, but he's true as steel. So that's kind of the way that when you're trying to, again, understand a personality, he's slow trot, he's old slow trot. You know, is that really a name that he deserves? Is there, as we start to look at some of these campaigns unfold, we can kind of decide, you know, where do we see what the real Thomas sort of emerge?
Sure. Now, I think it's we've done things similar to this on other battlefields. This one, of course, we're going to do over 5 days,
Right.
and we're going to go in different directions. We're going to start in Chattanooga, we're going to work up into Kentucky, then we're going to come back down to Nashville, and then we're going to go back down to Chattanooga, I think, and then we're going to go down to Atlanta, and then we come back and go up and finish in Nashville. And we're gonna see the war from 61 through 64 in this period of time.
Well, we're going to really do, like you said, kind of moving up and back just because of circumstance more than anything else. And I think it'll probably, we'll go to and from Chattanooga, I think was what we had talked about doing, as opposed to Nashville. So it won't quite go as far back up as we had done. You cannot cover but so much ground, because otherwise you just can't do justice to.
That's right.
That's right. Any place, because if you want to see everything, you're going to see it in very small snippets. If you want to see things in depth, you just can't go but so far, and that's just the nature of the beast. I know every time I ever did riding with Forrest, including a number of them, a lot of them with Ed Bars, you know, we tried to go a lot of places, but there were still places we couldn't go, and there were things we couldn't do, because you just can't do it all. You can't do it all.
But you know, the nice thing about this and the way that you organize this thing is that you picked battles and locations that Thomas is so central to it that in effect it's kind of a Western survey course.
That's right.
People are going to get a chance to do a greatest hits of the Western theater all in 1 week, and going, well, hell, you're going to go from Kentucky to Tennessee into Georgia.
Yes.
And you'll be on the cusp of Alabama.
You know, you can't do, he didn't go to Vicksburg, so he's not at Vicksburg. And so you're not going to be able to do a lot of those kinds of things, but there's so much that he does do, and so much that is, I think you've said it spot on, that he's central to.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes this particularly interesting. I mean, when you pitched that and I sat down and focused on the real essence of what you were proposing, we did this similar in Gettysburg. We broke Gettysburg apart into a number of places. We followed Sickles, we followed Meade, we followed Longstreet and Stewart and Ewell and Lee, and you know, over a 6-year period, because each one had a different component. But in this place, Thomas is like the Lord Cornwallis of the Western theater. I mean, he's everywhere there's anything important to happen, and he's going to be central to that action by nature of his experience and his capabilities. And in some places like Chickamauga, he really shines. Other places like the Atlanta campaign, he also shines. He shows what he's capable of, so much so that Sherman sends him back and makes him ostensibly responsible for the middle Tennessee and that whole area, while he goes and takes provisions and relief to Grant. So it's a fascinating study with that. And with that, I've gotten the first question, and others, if you want to ask a question, this would be a good time to go. Bear with me. I'm going to pull up this first question for you. Okay. Brian, Andy Altomos said he was interested in hearing you explain that Thomas was meticulous, attempted to be fully prepared before initiating action. Andy said it struck him because Grant and others criticized General Warren for the same traits, and this eventually led to his relief at Five Forks. Andy asked if you could briefly contrast Warren and Thomas in this respect.
We're back to that comment about the fact that if you mesh with someone, they'll overlook some things and or give you leeway that they don't do when you don't mesh. And the reason that I made that comment was not because Thomas was incapable, that Warren was incapable. It's just that at the end of the day, when you are Ulysses Grant and you're most comfortable with the people that do the things the way you want them to be done in the style that you expect, and others don't measure up, they're going to suffer some consequences. Now, sometimes that's deserved. I mean, there were certainly figures that needed to be shelved, McClernand and Butler and others,
Yeah.
come to mind. I mean, there's people that need another job. I always loved Robert E. Lee in the sense that he knew that when someone didn't do something quite the way he wanted, they ended up in the Trans-Mississippi. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah. He
graveyard
went.
generals, as they say. But with Thomas and Warren, I mean, you have people that are highly capable and certainly folks that have proven themselves, and yet both of them are kind of under a cloud in the sense that, again, think about some of Thomas's troops get pulled out to go as far away as doing some prison guarding duties up north. I mean, the army really is being taken away from Thomas at the end of the war because Grant has sort of reached his point of thinking, well, I've got to make a statement. And if you're going to make a statement on George Thomas, I mean, I don't know that Warren's deserves any more or less treatment than that. And so that's the problem. Grant just he was his man and he was his own thing and he did things his way. And I do think that I've come to admire a lot of things about Grant as a commander. He had a meticulous interest in detail himself that I don't think people always appreciate. But Rosecrans it kind of is a big influence on Thomas because they both kind of have a lot of interest in those elements of what makes an army more effective in the field, from logistics to scouting and spying to just go down the list. And yet again, if you're sort of that, we don't need to worry about all those details, let's just go ahead and plunge forward. Those are two very different ways of looking at that warfare.
Sure. Um, you know, the there are elements in which war goes a different way. It goes away, and Gone with the Wind is not a bad title for a description of the Civil War. Because the wind swept through Georgia, and it swept all the remnants of the armies of the West generally back towards the east, and the final acts are played out primarily in North Carolina and Virginia. Um, but what you have after all this is you've got a country that has been shattered. It's set aside. It's been broken into its component parts. The key leaders in the southern states that have moved apart have initially been disenfranchised. The people who ran the South no longer will run the South, and the government has to transition from war fighting to military governance and reconstruction. Could you address Thomas's role in the Reconstruction and any rewards he got for his performance and any punishments, in your opinion, he suffered?
I'm going to answer that by actually coming at a lot of different angles. So just hang in there with me, and
Sure.
I think you'll follow. Thomas had so many more interests than people realize. He was a scientist. Schofield kind of made an offhand comment that basically he didn't think Thomas was very smart. And yet Thomas was very smart, a very capable, very intelligent person. And he sent specimens to the Smithsonian. He is the kind of person that has a real instinctive understanding of personality and psychology. I mentioned when he was saying that I did pretty fast moving for a slow man in Alaska. He also said that he wished we'd had Alaska before the war so that we could have sent all those hotheads to Alaska. He thought extremism on any side was problematic. And so even in Reconstruction, he's not this kind of Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction figure, but he did not tolerate anyone who didn't accept the fact the war was over and you had lost. In other words, when the war is over, accept the outcome and take it and move on, but don't continue to wave flags in our face. Don't continue to try to show resistance to what as we move forward, what we do. I mean, you've taken the steps, you've gone to the battlefield, you've now been defeated, and that's a reality. And so for Thomas, there just wasn't a whole lot of sense to extremism, but there also wasn't a sense that a defeated South needed to be able to do whatever it wanted. In other words, just to be free to go in whatever direction it wanted. When I'm teaching my class, I always spend in the Civil War and Reconstruction, I always spend a lot of time in the pre-war period talking about the development of what we call the free labor ideology or ideology. And Eric Foner really created the best descriptions of all of that. But in many ways, that same template is what the North attempts to impose on the South. And it makes sense to them because they had always thought that was the superior model of society anyway, and that Southern society was inferior. And so what the last thing they would do is want to reinvent and actually sort of resurrect, I guess is a better way to put it, resurrect what the South had been. We need to change it into what it should be. And from that perspective, this free labor ideology or ideology of people having incentives and working and raising themselves up and lifting themselves up, having a sense of progress and little d democracy and education and all of these things. For the people who believed in that sort of thing, that's what they wanted the South to become. And I do think Thomas would have seen that kind of position for the South to be favorable to the South and to be positive for the South over the long haul. It's kind of like medicine. It might be bitter, but you swallow it and you have a chance to get better.
That's right.
So I think that was a Thomas approach. I mean, I don't think Thomas looked at it as punishment or as something to throw around your weight. And yet, if you have to, you step in, you get whatever job you need to do, you get it done. And he would not be afraid to do it. I mean, that's one thing I think you could count on Thomas. You're talking about his traits of dependability and resolution and determination, and of course, meticulous planning and all those things we've already mentioned. Those things also part of what gives him a real authority in the Reconstruction period.
Okay. Brian, I've got two questions that popped up. I think they're both reasonable. So I'm going to ask your indulgence as I ask those and let you answer them. And then we'll wrap this up as we're getting to about 5 minutes of 9.
Okay.
So the first question comes from Bob Jenkins, your good friend up in Dalton. And he says, can you ask Dr. Wills to expound on the Grant-Thomas relationship at Chattanooga? I like his analysis about Grant's thoughts about Thomas, about them not just gee-hawing old school, new modern warfare school, but also can Brian touch on the misunderstanding about rank between Grant and Thomas?
Well, I don't want to mess with the question of rank. One of the things Thomas would say at another time would be that if I'm put under a stick, I will be sure to follow the orders of the stick. So even when he was unhappy about things, and that was in regard to the advancement of Rosecrans, when he felt like he should be the one who should go forward. And by the way, in the Kentucky campaign, the reason why that was a problem was that Thomas was given the opportunities as midstream, mid-campaign, replaced Don Carlos Buell, and said no. And he said no in part because he had not created the command that was carrying out the campaign. He had not planned the campaign itself, and he felt it was a disservice to him. It was a disservice to his predecessor, in that case to Buell, and a disservice to the Army that he would be asked to lead, that he did not have it prepared and the plan under his own sort of control, for lack of better terms. Thomas, by showing that hesitancy, unfortunately, then opened the door for people to say, okay, well, we'll let the Virginian wait. And Thomas was very sensitive to that, very prickly to that. When Chattanooga occurred, of course, Thomas took over from Rosecrans. Thomas all along knew what his place was. I mean, the famous line, "I'll hold the town till we starve." But to even ask him, to hold the town was in a sense to say, it's possible that you would not hold it the way I want you to hold it. And you could almost look at it as sort of dismissive and almost like a backhand statement, hold the town until I get there. And then, I'll hold it till we starve. Instead, Thomas responds very professionally. And I think that was always the case in his public roles and his professional sense, that he got angry, but a lot of that anger he suppressed. In fact, he dies in 1870 from basically a heart attack, stroke, whatever it was that affected him at the end of his life. And it just hit him suddenly. But it came from all of repressing all that stuff. You can hold that in and it eventually just kind of gets to you. But at Chattanooga, when Grant arrives, there's a whole question about, was Thomas? I think Larry Daniels says he was passive aggressive. I mean, there were different comments about him, being hostile to Grant. I think the problem when Grant suddenly shows up in the middle of nowhere is, from Thomas's perspective, it caught Thomas off guard, and he didn't handle off guard very well. He liked to have his ducks in a row. He liked to have things organized and prepared appropriately. And of course, a lot of what we know, John Wilson will tell us. And of course, Wilson always had his own self-serving motivation for everything, including supposedly telling Thomas what to do and how to behave, which, you have to wonder whether that actually occurred or not. The point I'm making, though, again, there was not so much hostility as there was a circumstance in which Thomas was caught unawares, unprepared, whatever you want to say, and it threw him off his stride. And I don't care who you are. If you're a human being and you're a certain personality and a certain type of figure, when you get caught in an awkward situation, there may be a moment before you get your footing. It may be a moment before you get to respond in the way that maybe you would have had things been different. I always think of in the Eastern Theater when Jackson comes into the campaign and he's not performing like the Jackson of the Valley in the Peninsula the way that we want him to. He's a human being. He's tired. He's exhausted. All these things are part and parcel of human beings. In a war setting where on paper, you expect A, B, and C to occur, and maybe it isn't quite as neat a progression and easy to explain, or the outcome is not as predictable as we would like. Jackson of the Valley is not the Jackson who arrives in Richmond. Thomas, when Grant shows up all of a sudden, is not the Thomas we would expect him to be.
Sure. I've got one last question here. Shane Teasley asked if concerning Schofield and Thomas and their relationship, he'd like to know a little bit more about that. He said he knew that they had some issues stemming back to an encounter they had at West Point. Can you talk to that relationship?
If you like Schofield, you will not like what I say about Schofield or what I write about Schofield. I will say, you asked me a question of aha moments and so forth. I had a lot of things I learned about Thomas through the course of writing this book and doing the research for it. I had not really had a particular opinion about Schofield one way or the other. When I was finished this book, I have an opinion about Schofield, a pretty strong opinion about Schofield. if Schofield wanted to run for president, he should not worry about receiving my vote. Let's say it that way. He was undermining, backstabbing. Can you blame it on something from West Point days? Can you blame it on just his own personality, Schofield's own character? I don't know how far. I did not, thank goodness, write a biography of Schofield, because I don't know what I could have done about that. You know, when they said how difficult it would be to write a biography about Grady McQuinney writing a biography about Bragg.
Bragg, yeah.
Difficult because you have to live with him. I would not want to live with Schofield. One of my favorite comedians, and I won't go into who he is, but it's one of my favorite comedians. They asked him, Brother Dave, are you against communism? And he said, no, sir, I wouldn't get that close to it. And that's kind of how I feel about Schofield. I do think Schofield directly contributed to Thomas's death. And I think it was partly that same backbiting, undermining, self-serving behavior that he had already long demonstrated. And there's more than one reference in the book when Thomas is confronted with orders and he says, who in the world would say these things and write these things? He says, do you recognize the handwriting? And he said, yes. And he's like, oh my, well, it's like suddenly Thomas sort of dawned on him that someone would behave in a fashion that he would not even have dreamed of. You know, at the end of the day, it's interesting when we judge history, we act as if everybody always knew whatever was going to happen in the future. And most of the time, since they don't know the future, these people do not act in a way that they will be able to anticipate it coming forward. And whether that's Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or anything else, we always want to impose somehow that they should have known, or why didn't they know, or maybe they knew and it was a conspiracy. Most of these folks are dealing day to day the best they can with the limited knowledge they have. And again, it's interesting to watch Thomas sort of learning about how not everyone is as noble a person as he is. And I think that really probably if you could have asked him, would have been the most disappointing thing, that any comrade would not be completely noble in their behavior as he thought that people ought to be.
You know, the thing I once read 46 years in the old Army, Schofield's autobiography, and you reminded me in discussing that there are two ways to the top in the military. And being a student in the military and having been in the military myself for 20 years, the thing that I always observed is that there were two tracks to general and to leadership. The first track was combat proven. Ultimately, the very best of the class, didn't matter whether they were 26th in their class or first in their class, the best in their class eventually, when the opportunities arose, became great combat leaders, and they contributed to the ultimate victory. And as part of the reward for that, they then went into the leadership of the Army in the post-war world. Mm-hmm. There was a second grouping of people, and as we remember, Schofield was a youngster in the Civil War. He certainly is of a different generation, and his post-war period, he's got to wait for Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan to all have their piece of the action.
That's right.
And he's got to kiss a lot of ass in the time from the end of the Civil War until the Spanish-American War, and his opportunity to be in charge of the Army. And you see a change of the personalities and stuff. And we have, unfortunately, a lot of people in various epochs of the Army's history who, in periods of peace, learned to kiss the right rear ends, get the right political connections, do the things they had to do, and they find themselves wearing the mantle as the 11th Chief of Staff of the United States Army, or the 16th Chief of Staff of the Army, because there was a long enough period of peace that they were able to rise not on combat proficiency, but on their ability to interact with politicians and get the right assignments and the right sponsorships. So with that, Brian, it has been, again, a delight. 25 or 30 good years of friendship. We should talk more often and on a wide variety of subjects.
We've actually been a lot of places. I was just thinking about going to the Shaker Village in Kentucky. My dad's passed away, of course, but my mom was there and still at 93 going strong. And so,
Oh, yeah, Harriet,
where I
right?
get my interest in history. My mom was a history teacher, and of course, I read books and history books all my life. So.
Well, it's a wonderful, what's that old expression say? You mean we get paid to do this? Yeah, it's a lot of
Yeah, but
fun.
don't
And
tell anybody; they may not want to pay us. So.
no, they won't. They'll think we ought to do this for free. Anyway, hey Brian, thanks a bunch, folks. If Brian is able, we'll stay up for another 5 or 10 minutes to answer any private questions you have. Other than that, thanks a whole lot. Next Wednesday night will be Steve Wise talking about Sherman's march through South Carolina. So thanks a bundle. Appreciate having you with us, and good night.